in the same spirit of international dialogue and collaboration, for which Robert Owen, on whom I will not be dwelling at any great length today, but he was renowned in his time for travel, pilgrimage, his international connections. He met basically every major figure in his long life, spanning the Tsars of Russia to the presidents of the newly created United States. A celebrated anecdote is Robert Owen standing in the middle of a battlefield when the Mexicans and the Americans were fighting over Texas. But all Robert Owen could see was land on which he could build a school. And he is standing with the Generalissimo Santa Anna, looking out over this land which he's going to rescue from the Texan swamps to build this utopian village with a school as its centerpiece, with the Texan cannonballs falling on either side of them, completely oblivious to the threat to his to life and limb occasioned by this. And that kind of typifies this part of the Owen heritage. Slightly obsessive, maybe somebody you wouldn't always want to hang around with, but visionary and committed to the idea, very, very candidly, the idea that education could transform the world. And it's part of my task today to try to show how two things. How that vision of education is, in key respects, distinctively Scottish. I've already referenced, Mexico, the United States, Texas. So it's also international, but it's got a distinctively Scottish pedigree. And I am a trained historian, but I'm not telling this story chiefly as an historian. I'm telling the story as an educator, because what matters about these themes is not their antiquarian interest, but the fact that they are living present values in our practices today, and I hope that will become visible in the rest of the afternoon. I've distilled the title and kind of refined the title from previous iterations in the light of the theme of your visit, because I think one of the key concepts that unifies the Scottish story and stamps its legacy, both domestically and internationally, is the idea of place. Scotland is small. Not only is it small, but it has had to exist immemorially alongside a much bigger neighbour. Almost everything one can say numerically about Scotland can be multiplied by a factor of 10 when compared to England. Aside from landmass, the landmass is more or less the same when you add in all the Scottish archipelagos. The same landmass as England, but historically and to the present day, a multiplier of 10, indeed now in terms of population, closer to 12. So small nations that are surrounded by big nations are always in interesting and potentially problematic situations which require imagination, cunning, diplomacy, connectivity, but also, above all, I think, a sense of what it means to belong. What does it mean to belong to Scotland in this fashion that has permitted it to survive? It hasn't been swallowed up by its major neighbour. Ireland was swallowed up for 1,000 years. Wales was swallowed up 800 years ago and still is basically swallowed up. And at the same time, Scotland has also had to find a way of living. within this archipelago of the United Kingdom. And central to that strategy, as I think I'll try to show you here, has been education. But education understood as centrally interwoven with place, with a specific location, whether that be the nation, the town, the university, indeed. With any national story, colleagues, we could more or less start anywhere, and I have started at different points when I've told this history to other audiences. But again, by virtue of your own priorities and focus, I'm starting with what historians call the early modern period. That's in traditional Western chronologies from the late 15th century up until the late 18th century, because this, although not the location of the formation of Scotland, Scotland is a much older nation than these centuries, it's the location of a transformation in Scotland, the creation of a modern society. And this is powerfully associated, colleagues, with the coming of the Protestant Reformation from Europe to Scotland, and the peculiar version of the Protestant Reformation that came to Scotland in the middle of the 16th century was from the outset inextricably linked with learning. You may have seen movies of Mary Queen of Scots, who got her head chopped off, or Queen Elizabeth. I don't know if the British obsession with the Tudors extends as far as Singapore, but no doubt every time you put on PBS or Netflix, you'll find another film about the Tudors. Well, it's that same period. It's that same period of religious and dynastic and political upheaval, when Scotland, as it were, opted to become a Protestant country in the 1560s. The Parliament declared for the Reformation. It overthrew the monarch, Mary Queen of Scots, who later came to an untimely end. And it began to seek to embed its peculiar version of Protestantism, Presbyterianism, the priesthood of all believers, in the towns and cities of the kingdom. And this became one of the major tasks of education. As I've said to many audiences many times, when one commits to the Protestant vision of redemption by understanding the scriptures, the Bible, then you have to have people who can read the Bible. Not priests who can read it in Greek and Latin and tell you what it says, but you yourself reading it in your own language, English or even Gaelic in the north of Scotland, understanding it for yourself and finding your individual road to salvation by virtue of being able to read it. In order to be able to read it, someone needs to teach you how to read. So this becomes a core responsibility of the central government, that there will be a school created in every parish. In every one of the new Protestant parishes, there will be a school with a schoolmaster who may be, it so happens, also the minister of religion, but we'll let that one go. Scots are always good at economising. And also, where the resources do not exist in families to pay for that education, it will be offered on the parish, at the cost of the parish. Now, this might feel a bit like a kind of manifesto for the Protestant Reformation in Scotland. It's easy to tell this story when one digs down into the data, it's never quite as simple as a few bullet points on a slide. For a start, and here is another motif that will stay with us for the whole afternoon, Scotland was historically a poor country. Think of that big neighbour I began with, England. Scotland is subject to scarcity, to famine, to internecine civil strife, to violence, and there are rarely sufficient resources to create a school in every parish with a paid schoolmaster. It happens in some locations, some of the time. It happens in a small number of locations all of the time, particularly this city. This city of Glasgow is relatively prosperous compared to the surrounding rural regions, and more or less this part of West Central Scotland manages a kind of minimal provision of a school in every parish for most boys and some girls to attend in a kind of erratic or irregular fashion. To the extent that by the time the union between Scotland and England is strengthened through the creation of a single monarch, Mary Queen of Scots' son, a Protestant, Mary Queen of Scots' son is the heir to the childless Elizabeth I, back to your Tudor television programmes, and the crowns come together. And James moves from Edinburgh to London to become James I of this united kingdom. The most obvious signifier of this, colleagues, and again it's a pretty tortuous area at the level of granularity and detail, is literacy levels. I'm not going to dwell on the complexities of how we define literacy and how we've refined our definitions over the generations. There are different ways of cutting this particular cake. Is literacy reading and writing? Is literacy only reading? Do you need to read that Bible, but do you really need to be able to write anything other than your X on a legal document or a submission to the parish for financial relief? Nevertheless, with all these precautions around it, we can still say confidently that between about 1600 and 1800, Scotland's literacy levels are second only to the Prussians and the Austrians. Much, much richer societies in Europe. And they are about 6 times the literacy rate of England. So there is this higher level of what we might call functional literacy among the general population, subject of course to irregularities and unevenness across kingdoms, across regions, across genders, across generations, and of course disrupted by these other factors that I've alluded to, like war and plague and famine. I use a particular word at the top of that slide that I think is important also for the rest of the presentation and the rest of the afternoon. And this is the idea that we're trying to build a virtuous society. Now again, it's a society subject to violence, caprice, oppression, exploitation, inequality, but there is a principle, an idea that somehow education is involved in the project of producing better people. That we will educate the next generation to be more virtuous than we were, to be better Christians or to be better humanists or whatever. And that, I think, is one of the, if you see this almost like geologically, it's like a deposit in the geology, the layers of the Scottish educational experience. There is the father of the Scottish Reformation, John Knox, the statue in Edinburgh, and there's one of the earliest representations of what you might call a Protestant classroom. The schoolmaster robed out in very medieval looking gear, by the way, with a small group, mostly boys, the occasional girl admitted, and certainly no bar on girls being educated. Now, another vital strand of this emerges out of this next stage in this balletic dance of Scotland and England to get the most out of each other, shall we say, putting it as neutrally as possible. And that is the union of the parliaments after a century of warfare and upheaval, and as I've said in other presentations, the real prospect of the failure of the Scottish state in the middle of the 17th century. It plunged into terrible conflict, social conflict and religious conflict. And the solution is eventually found, if one can risk that description, in a union of the parliaments to match the union of the crowns. In the settlement of the union, where Scotland ceased to have a separate parliament in Edinburgh and shipped its members of parliament to London, three things were to remain absolutely legally and constitutionally preserved in distinctive Scottish forms. One is law. The Scottish legal system to this day is very different from England's. Religion, the Presbyterian settlement, where of course the English settlement is still based on bishops, and education. And that's education of all tiers. Education in local communities and schools, up to education in the universities. Because Scotland, despite being 1/10 the size of England consistently through this period, has 4-5 universities, where England only has 2, Oxford and Cambridge, and where admission to Oxford and Cambridge is reserved for those who are communicating members of the Church of England. So these institutions, which will go on to play an enormously important role in the creation of Scottish modern identity, are central to the accommodation reached between Scotland. This brings me to what I think is the second big theme. If the first theme is virtue, the second theme might be captured in the idea of work. That being educated is strongly connected with the labour of hand and mind, and one might also say heart indeed. The notion of education being at the service of economic productivity, but more than that, that educational opportunity is open, at least in theory, to all who have the capacity to work. And again, this becomes, doesn't it, part of a kind of national stereotype of the Scots, famous for their work ethic nationally and internationally. The phrase that's used in Old Scots is the lad of parts, the boy of parts, the boy of capacities, the boy of talents. The boy of talent, if he comes out of a peasant farming village in the north of Scotland, theoretically, he should be able to go on and become a professor at the university. Now, it does actually happen sometimes. But even when it doesn't happen in practice, what does happen is this place-based sense that nothing should bar us, not station, not aristocracy, not blood, not land. All pathways should be open. Again, all my consistent caveats remain. Of course, this does not happen universally. It's regularly frustrated by the deep inequalities in Scottish society in this time as in any other European society. And of course, it has excluded groups. It's not home to Catholics, for example. Not that there's that many Catholics left in Scotland by this stage, but certainly they can't do it. It's only rarely open to women, and of course, women cannot attend the universities. But I hope you see what I'm driving at here. It's about how ideals, principles, aspirations become imprinted on the national psyche. And when their moment comes historically, they can be activated. And this, again, if we relate this to the content of the first slide, this consistent message is projected to heritors, basically rich people, that they have a duty of care for the schools and schoolmasters and school children in their towns and villages and settlements. Now, sometimes, like any other taxable population, they grumble, they complain, they find ways around it, but they are taxed in a way that does not happen in England to pay for the salary of the schoolmaster, the provision of the buildings, and the resources for learning and teaching. This gives rise, in the course of time, and with many other elements in the cocktail, colleagues, to, I suppose, one of the contributions to human civilization for which Scotland is still most renowned, and that is the Scottish Enlightenment. There is a kind of pipeline of talent that comes from the manses, the parishes, the schools, the villages, the farming communities, through the universities, into towns and cities like Glasgow and Edinburgh and Aberdeen, which then become hubs of the European Enlightenment, centres through which the great ideas of the European mind are passing through Scottish society, causing social and intellectual transformation, and indeed, as our colleague Murray Pittock has argued in his recent book about Edinburgh, creating the first real smart city. That in Edinburgh there is this synergy of these forces of learning, science, mathematics, economics. We've just celebrated 300 years of Adam Smith in this university, also, of course, employed by Edinburgh University. Commerce, public health, infrastructure, economic development and innovation, changes in agriculture, transport, all coming out of this Scottish educational synthesis, which of course is then transmitted by other pathways to North America, to Asia, to Eastern and Southern Europe as well. Of course, again, every affirmative is a qualified affirmative in this presentation, because of course one of the means by which these ideas are disseminated is through the British Empire. Scotland, as it were, after the Union of Parliaments, becomes a full partner in the British imperial enterprise. And that, of course, begins chiefly with the North American colonies, but is soon extending to second and third iterations of that empire. It is, of course, and we have confronted it very openly in this university for the last decade, It is, of course, strongly associated with the Atlantic slave trade, the creation of the Caribbean, all these, Caribbean people with Scottish surnames, because the landowner was a Scottish plantation manager. And we've had to see this as both, a celebration of Scottish capitalism and ingenuity, Scottish invention and enterprise, but also imperial oppression and exploitation and extractive domination of other societies. The surpluses of this imperial project, of course, come to be part of the investment routes of industrialisation. And as a result of these surpluses, plus of course its own extraordinary natural resources, Scotland is the whole of central Scotland is basically a coalfield. Industrialisation comes early to Scotland in all its dynamism, in all its energy, in all its transformative potential, in all its injustices and inequalities and violence as well. The upheaval to settled patterns of agrarian life, the movement of people, the attraction of large numbers of people from Ireland over to Scotland, the enormous strain placed on the infrastructure of these same Enlightenment cities when their populations were doubling by the decade. And of course, colleagues, this again is another word, as it were, that resonates through our whole day: inequality and poverty. Because inequality stalks the streets of this city right now, here in 2023, with thousands of children living in homes with incomes well below the poverty line, thousands of children relying on local authority food supplies over the summer vacation from school. So this becomes part of the narrative of this experience of modernisation that cannot simply be sublimated in a concept of work, because these are unjust conditions of working. We also have, and this is, I'm not going to dwell on them today, I did make that observation, but this bullet point is in some ways capturing the whole slide, really. A school in every parish might work when you've got 1,000 people in that parish. A school in every parish when you've suddenly got 6,000 people in that parish, 10,000 people in that parish, is not going to work. And the system collapses, leading to a crisis in the whole vision of education. One of the solutions or responses to that crisis is the Parliament in London and the authorities in Edinburgh allowing diversification of the educational provision. So other providers of schools are given some license to offer education. And a favourite model, this was not the only one, a favourite model is the factory school, where enlightened employers, men who've come through the Enlightenment kind of experience and who see they have social responsibilities alongside their wealth creation, suddenly start attaching schools to their factories and to the villages in which their workers live. The most celebrated of these, United Nations Heritage Site, I urge you to try to see it, it's not very far from here, is New Lanark, founded by Robert Owen. Robert Owen, a man from Wales, whose own educational experiences are very patchy and very idiosyncratic, and who's really educated in London and Manchester in the workplace, and who comes with his ideas for the reform of cotton production to Scotland. Meets a nice girl who happens to be the daughter of another wealthy cotton magnate, and well, they all lived happily ever after, basically. There it is, that's New Lanark, beside the fast-flowing River Clyde. The productive power of New Lanark rose tenfold in the space of a decade because of technological innovation, but Robert Owen saw it chiefly not for its cotton-producing vitality, but for its iconic provision of education. Schools for small children, infant schools, schools for older children, and indeed adult and lifelong learning as well. So again, you see, colleagues, how we're back to the idea of place. The place is important. Belonging to New Lanark means you belong to a concept of learning. And that learning is about social justice, transformation, improving living standards, and more equality. Above it, possibly the only part of old Edinburgh University that remains, but Edinburgh University, of course, one of the central nodes of the international enlightenment. As I've suggested to you, this kind of improvised, higgledy-piggledy educational provision, still the parish system, but it's buckled under the strain of population explosions. This licensing of other providers, the reliance on charity, it starts to dawn on the central authorities that this is not enough. And it comes across in two forms, colleagues. It first comes across in cities like Glasgow, where the spectacle of poverty, urban sprawl, death and disease is so stark that enlightened thinkers, clergymen, activists and communities realise this model cannot go on. It is not working, and indeed it has within it the potential for revolutionary upheaval if it is not dealt with. And secondly, industrialisation. The second and third stages of industrialisation, after all, the steam engine is perfected by James Watt on these premises, about 100 metres from here, by a public-private partnership between James Watt and the University of Glasgow, renting them laboratory facilities. But why do they do that? They do that because, of course, the Germans, the Austrians, and the French are catching up. So if we're going to keep, so there's a carrot and stick here. There's the threat of a real discontented proletariat that might do what the proletariat in France has done in 1789. But also the possibility of Britain no longer being the chief industrial nation, but being overtaken by the Germans. Now, where have you heard that before? So we have David Stowe, a legendary minister, Church of Scotland minister, who thinks, well, one of the things we've got to do is we can't keep relying on the minister happen to have been a man who went to university and therefore he'll make a good school teacher. We have to train a separate profession of teachers, and David Stowe does this by creating possibly the world's first system of certificated teacher training here in Glasgow. But even with these extraordinary measures that creative people like Robert Owen or David Stowe are taking, there's still a national dilemma. We've prided ourselves for what 2 centuries, 3 centuries, on being this educated community, what if we're not quite as educated as we think we are? And so you have this moment of real national self-doubt. You have this real self-doubt. And this becomes increasingly obvious the more Scottish educated teachers and young people are exported out to the empire, carrying the reputation of the Scottish system with them. But there is, at last, an awakening in government occasioned by this threat to industrial competitiveness to investigate. A parallel endeavour takes place in England as well, sending out what are called commissioners to examine learning and teaching in every school in the land. In Scotland, it takes the shape in the 1860s of the Argyll Commission, who visit every school in Scotland and come back with many warnings to the government that the education system is failing, that many young people are leaving without necessary literacy and numeracy, but also something else, a stark message. And it's this: you can't do it by volunteers anymore. You can't do it by charity. You can't do it by churches. Only one provider can do it: the nation. This is what the Germans, of course, the Prussians have discovered before the Scots, before the British. They're the only possible provider of education on scale is the state. But hold on to that, because this becomes a very living theme for 2023 as well. There is David Stowe's normal school. It's not far from here. It's about 15 minutes from here. This is his training manual, which went into 14, 15 editions, and disseminated across the British Empire. But this is what they were facing. This is from the 1860s. The poverty, illiteracy, disease, malnutrition on the streets of Glasgow. This is the parish system couldn't possibly cope with that. So the Education Act of 1872, I'll speed up a bit. The Education Act of 1872 is the major fruit of this. But again, you see, what's obsessing me here is the idea of belonging and community. This is the nation state deciding that its systems are not fit for purpose and they need radical reform. They need radical reform in the creation of new bodies that can look after schools in their communities, in the creation of new agencies, chiefly colleges, which can train and educate teachers properly in the latest methods that the Germans and the French and the Americans have discovered. And above all, that can make education compulsory. Education is to become compulsory for all boys and girls up to the age of 13. Now, 13 may seem a modest age by today's standards, but this was an enormous breakthrough. And remember, again, we're still talking about Scotland racked with poverty, still subject to domination by English interests and a remote parliament, not a democratic parliament by any means. And so important questions are left unanswered in 1872, particularly what's to happen to secondary education. But my message here is community. It's not a democratic society, so you're not getting to vote for who's going to run the government or who's going to run the schools, but there is still that deep-seated sense that the schools belong to the people. and the people's voices need to be heard in the shaping of these schools. Again, this shows you that's one of the earliest of the post-1872 schools. You know, children lining up, boys and girls educated together. For the time, nice new premises. These, the first downhill, the first, that's it, past and present, the first Roman Catholic teacher training college, which subsequently merged with this university some 25 years ago. So a national strategy is what the 1872 Act epitomizes. But of course it's not enough. It's not enough. And it has many shortcomings. Chief among its shortcomings are it still misses out large sections of the population. And it is not fair to girls. Girls can still not go on to higher education, extraordinary though that may seem. The campaign for women's suffrage, the coming of the First World War and the migration of many women into jobs previously done by men, all turn the lever on these injustices and expose them to public scrutiny. In 1918, the franchise is extended to all women over the age of 30 and to another 7 million working class men. They are no longer, many of them have watched brothers, sons, fathers die in the trenches. They are no longer going to tolerate this scale of injustice and social exclusion. So what the 1918 Act does is dramatic. It's dramatic. It takes the schools have belonged, remember, previously to the church, then to the school boards appointed by remote civil servants and government authorities, but they are now being given to local councils. And these local councils are elected on the popular franchise. This has remained one of the pillars of the Scottish model, colleagues, ever since. Local authorities are responsible for almost all of Scotland's schools. Scotland does have a small and flourishing independent or private school system, but it's very small. 96% of Scottish pupils are educated in their local schools. So that means there's massive buy-in from the middle classes, for example, who are traditionally the supporters of independent education. And, at least on paper, these schools are accountable. These authorities are accountable to the voters when they go to the polls if they're unhappy with the way in which the schools are being run. So this is about the relationship of education to democracy. And of course, it's not simply that schools are coming to be seen as reflections of a democratic society. It's that schools are coming to be seen as producers of a democratic society. You will produce a democratic population by virtue of raising the educational attainment and opportunity for the general population. So the 1918 Act raises the school leaving age to 15. This was the legislation under which my own parents were educated. They create two types of secondary school, one for the more academic and one for sections of the population who are supposedly heading into trade and commerce and industry. And they also radicalise the professionalisation of teaching by requiring mandatory teaching qualifications for working in schools. Again, something that was never done in the same way in England, and which continues to be rolled out in Scotland today, even in independent schools in Scotland. you must be registered with the General Teaching Council in order to teach. Just again, the juxtaposition, what gives us that is this huge human toll, blood and treasure spent in prevailing in the First World War. You cannot bring people back to the same terrible housing conditions, the same terrible schools, the same terrible health conditions. There's no magical bullet to transform society, but there is progress, and better schools and better education is certainly the result of that. I would say, bringing this to a close, and that's why one can project these bullet points together, because the detail is less than the sum of its parts, as it were. Basically, this trajectory is reinforced by the developments in the 20th century, developments between the two wars. And again, I ask you to consider this in relation to your own society. The ever-increasing synergies, or a better word, integration. The integration of education into the institutional culture of the welfare state. Now, this has its critics, of course, who feel that perhaps the core mission of education is compromised by being too closely bound up with the other demands of the welfare state. There are other champions of this view who would say, well, look, education, health and well-being, after all, one of the central structures of Scottish schooling today, decent housing, poverty reduction, these cannot be disaggregated. We have to see them as part of an integrated national vision of what the government is there to do for the population. Alongside this, of course, you have increased telecommunications, contact with other education systems, and Scotland becomes one of the pioneers of what came to be called progressive education. That's reforming pedagogy, classroom practice, pupil-centred learning, child-centred constructions of education, real books in the classroom, group working and collaboration as important as individual competitiveness, education for all, rather than only a small academic elite receiving qualifications. Everyone should receive a qualification that's appropriate for their capacities and their ambitions. Again, you'll hear echoes of what I've said previously, the close relationship between education and work, education and the broader society. And of course, perhaps the capstone on this period is the restoration at the end of the 1990s of a separate Edinburgh devolved Scottish Parliament, and the return of responsibility for education from the Westminster government in London to the Edinburgh government in Holyrood. And Des, who's sitting at the back there, Des has been an important part of that in his eventful career as a politician and an educator. I put something up I won't dwell on. You can see it. I'll make sure everybody gets a copy of the slides. But the provision of teacher education in Scotland is a good illustration of where we see these forces coming together. As I suggested, everyone who teaches in a school in Scotland must be registered with the General Teaching Council. There are recognised domestic pathways into becoming a primary teacher or a secondary teacher. You can ask me questions about that. Any one of us could answer these questions if you wish to pursue that. And there's an integrated framework of standards from admission into the profession to becoming a school principal. I suppose, let me, before I distill it into a final slide of, as it were, values, two pictures, one from the school my wife and son work in, both primary teachers, and our local high school. This is Cumbernauld High School, a few hundred metres from where I live, just opened a couple of years ago. It's got a theatre, a cinema, it's got Olympic standard swimming pool, it's got fantastic sports facility. Now, is this typical of every school in Scotland? No, but it is. It is, colleagues, it is a local authority school, and all boys and girls in that area are eligible to attend it when they turn 12. So it does show something of what the ideal can mean as a practice. It's also a very impressive school. I've been in it several times. How would I distill this? This is the only one where I put a question mark around it. I began by trying to stress to you that these principles are often frustrated. They're often not realised. They're often not fulfilled. The institutions falter and fail, and they're subject to very powerful forces which can be extraordinarily difficult for even a democratic society to govern. Nevertheless, I think it is possible to extract from this concept of place and learning these values. The first is the ideal of social inclusion, that all should be offered education, and nowadays that spans a full spectrum of needs, including the neurodivergent, including those who previously would have been packaged off in special schools or institutions. The democratic intellect, the idea that everyone should be able to flourish to the limits of their potential and beyond, regardless of their social station. Again, does that always happen? Absolutely not. Absolutely not does it always happen. But it is still an ideal, and there's still a lot of political capital vested in trying to achieve it. The idea that education is a service to society and culture, and which I do see expressed in our schools. I saw it incredibly explicitly manifest in the COVID period by the Children's Neighbourhood Scotland and the enormous amount of work that was done with the most hard-pressed generation of teachers to deal with the challenges of that lockdown period. The idea that the teacher is a figure who matters in society and should be valued and respected as a public intellectual. The idea, which has become very powerfully expressed by the Scottish Parliament and the legislation it's passed in the last decades, that education should be rooted in these international principles of things like human rights, children's rights, the relational practices, the agency and individualism of learners, the multiple destinations from which young people might go post school, and finally, and this is perhaps the hardest one of all to fully vindicate, while at the same time one would never want to relinquish it, I don't think, that there is a social justice imperative in education. That education does have interventionist responsibilities as a righter of wrongs, a closer of gaps, an empowerer, an enabler of those without power and capacity. Thanks very much indeed.